They openly talk about it. I mean, I'm just often the sole representative in favor of the death penalty at these conferences, so they either forget me or ignore me. But they openly talk about that as a viable strategy. That is, we will simply, if necessary, coerce countries as a price for membership to abolish the death penalty. And they celebrate that because to them the greater good is the end of abolition. And any means necessary to that end is a means that they will embrace. And economic coercion is something that they're quite skilled in and used to doing. But I don't think, given the world economic situation and the power that the United States has, the economic power today, that they are seriously going to entertain and carry through with any threat to stop trading with us. It's just too valuable. We're giving them too much.
Now, you brought up Turkey, and I read recently that Turkey has agreed to terms of non-extradition vis-a-vis the United States unless we give them assurances that the United States will not call for the death penalty to certain, for example, terrorists that they may be harboring or what have you. Do you think that by certain states continuing or federal law continuing to implement the death penalty, it's in effect winning the battle and losing the war against terrorism, because we're somehow in a way incentivizing countries to harbor potential terrorists?
Well, you yourself, if I recall, in our first meeting brought up this.
And that's not just Turkey, actually. I think it's Germany, it's Canada,
yes,
it's Spain, it's more than a handful.
Yes, I mean there are going to be winks and nods going on in terms of fleeing terrorists and who is going to be the ones to capture them. And when certain countries know that if they capture them, then they're committed not to turn them over as long as we might go for death, then they'll sort of back off and let U.S. agents capture them so that U.S. agents can execute them. But even when it's done in a principled way, if you asked me about a slippery slope the first time we met, and where does it all end? Well, you didn't mention another country. You mentioned Canada, our northern border. You didn't mention the country at our southern border, Mexico. Mexico recently announced that not only won't they extradite people to the United States to stand trial who will face the death penalty, they won't extradite people to the United States who face potential life without parole, because that too violates their constitution. And something else that is not widely known or understood, because the New York Times, the abolitionist mouthpiece that it is,
I was just going to say, why don't I know about this? Why haven't I heard about this?
Because you read the New York Times. Europe abolished life without parole approximately 18 months ago. There's been no indication of that in the Times. That was a cataclysmic event. That's a major event. Europe has no life without parole. There is an argument, and a very valid one right now, that life without parole from the European perspective violates basic international conventions, and therefore they would not extradite someone who not only faced the death penalty, they could argue that they should not extradite someone to stand trial who potentially faced life without parole. And again, before we embrace European justice, which is the implication of part of your question, let's not forget a couple of things, and terrorism and its effect. Matasadik, I forgot his first name, was recently convicted of over 3,000 counts of murder. He was the founder of the Hamburg al-Qaeda cell. He funneled the money to the operatives. He provided them cover as students in Germany and helped them go to flight training in the United States. He was convicted of, I believe, 3,015 counts of murder, and he was just sentenced under German law after 3,000 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, which is 1.8 days for each victim.
That's clearly shocking. And another fact that I hadn't heard in the press, actually.
Yes. Well, actually, the New York Times did report that, if I recall, and rather briefly. It was a bit embarrassing, because if the American people really got wind of that and really chewed on it a little bit, they would realize the vast gulf between us and Europe, and before they would accede to the kind of arguments that all the civilization is happening on the other side of the Atlantic when it comes to punishment, I think even many abolitionists would retch at the thought of appropriate punishment being, and by the way, that was the maximum under German law, and he may not serve, it's entirely possible that he will be released after 10 years, in which case it's a day. Kill a person, lose a day of liberty. This is the justice that we're supposed to emulate. This is the abolitionism that we're supposed to see as the future and we're supposed to embrace as a more refined country. Result. My view
That's one extreme, but then there's the other, well, I don't know if it's an extreme, but out of all the nations that do administer capital punishment, how come that the United States is the only democracy that does that? You have the Congo, you have China, and then you have the United States, you have Iran.
I'm so pleased you asked that question in just that way. How come the United States is the only democracy? If we look at the public opinion polls, first of all, if we back up a little bit in history, every single European country that abolished the death penalty abolished it in the teeth of overwhelming public support for it. That is, every single European government ignored the popular will. You don't need to believe me. My source for that is twofold. Roger Hood, who's an abolitionist, leading study of the death penalty in a worldwide perspective that has just reached its latest edition this year, reiterates that over and over again. Carol Steiker, a law professor at Harvard, also an abolitionist, has made that statement, and it's true, it's undeniable. Every country has abolished the death penalty in the teeth of overwhelming public support. Not only that, but overwhelmingly public support continues for the death penalty.
So you're suggesting that people they don't have their right to vote on this issue in several countries in Europe?
You say, why are we the only Western democracy, the only democracy? First of all, we're not the only democracy with the death penalty. India, which is the world's largest democracy, has the death penalty. Japan, which is another leading democracy in the world, also has the death penalty. But why are we the only Western democracy? Because we are the only Western democracy that is acting like a democracy. The latest public opinion polls in Canada, for example, place 52% of Canadians in favor of the death penalty. The latest public opinion poll in France that I know of has a slight majority in favor of the death penalty. By Peter Hodgkinson's own estimate, as a Brit, 70% of the English are in favor of the death penalty. It's that in Europe, the elites, the governmental elites, believe that they are there to tell the people what is right. In the United States, who is just committed to a republican form of government, a democracy, the government takes its cue from the people. The people don't take their cue from the government.
Well, if you still, according to some facts that I've uncovered of statistical information, if you compare the United States to Europe, the murder rate is 3 times as high here.
Yes, it is.
If you also look at certain statistical information from states, Texas, California, Oklahoma, either it shows that capital punishment has not affected the murder rate, or in fact it's acted counterintuitively. It's gone the wrong way. Now, do you think that it acts as a deterrent? And then should that be one of the supporting reasons for capital punishment, or is that just irrelevant as a consideration?
It's a two-part question. First, and again, the New York Times, the famous study, front page, lead article. States with the death, that's the headline, said states with the death penalty have higher murder rates than states without it, which is what you're repeating. And then they did a state-by-state breakdown to show that. Well, the United States is its own problem. The United States has a higher murder rate for many reasons, apart from the death penalty. The United States has a higher murder rate in part from a culture of violence, partly in the South, in large part in the South, but not exclusively in the South, and in some of the central cities. The United States has a higher murder rate by virtue of the proliferation of handguns and the Second Amendment. I mean, there are all sorts of complex reasons. But even within the United States, the thrust of your question is compare the states with the death penalty and the states without it, and you notice that the states with it still have higher murder rates. I mean, that's what the Times headline screams, and they compared Virginia and West Virginia, for example. Well, it's very interesting in the way they presented that, because they omitted a couple of salient points in that article and in this discussion that generally takes place on this issue. Number one is that by saying states, they of course omitted Washington, D.C., which, while not a state, is subject to its own municipal law, borders 2 states that have the death penalty, Virginia and Maryland, and does not have it, whereas their 2 neighboring states do have it, and has a much higher murder rate than any state in the United States has. If you include Washington, D.C. in it, instead of comparing Virginia to West Virginia, which is separated by a mountain range, and people don't go back and forth between Virginia and West Virginia, but do go back and forth between Virginia and D.C. and Maryland, you have just the contrary. Also, when you do a state-by-state breakdown, instead of a state-by-state breakdown, do a county-by-county breakdown, and look at the county in Texas, Harris County, that uses the death penalty most frequently, and you will see that it has the most precipitous decline in its murder rate. So that and thirdly, when you see statements made that the studies don't show a deterrent effect of the death penalty, that's simply false. In the last 18 months, there have been 4 leading studies, one from the University of Colorado, one from Houston, one from Emory, and the 4th from, I can't recall which, all of which have shown a significantly greater deterrent effect from the death penalty, the average of which says that it saves between 12 and 18 innocent lives. Does the death penalty deter? Of course it deters, but that's not really the issue. The issue for you when you ask that question is, does it deter more effectively than its principal alternative, life without parole?